Good morning, everyone. I'm going to make a slight apology, and I hate doing this. I've been explaining to Julian that I had technological disaster after disaster this morning, losing completely my PowerPoint, and I've got one, but the PowerPoint I'm going to give you is very close to, but not identical to the one I wanted to, which means that occasionally I'm going to have a slide pop up that I wasn't quite expecting. You'll have to forgive me for that. If I hadn't said all this, I'm hoping you wouldn't have even noticed there was a problem, but I'm preparing you for it. Now, as we go into it, I want to welcome you to the New Testament, an authentic and reliable book. And I'm focusing in just on one part of it. I want to talk to you about Luke, the historian. It may actually surprise you to know that Luke wrote over a quarter, 27% actually, of our New Testament. That's a sizable chunk of the whole Bible. And if Luke is shown to be a reliable historian in his gospel, then and the Acts of the Apostles, then we can trust his record of the life of Jesus and the early Christian church. And so what I'm going to be showing you is the accuracy and the reliability of Luke. I think the best thing we can do is introduce you to two people before I come to Luke. You may not have heard of him, but I want to introduce you to Sir Charles William Ramsay. William Ramsay was a very famous archaeologist, and he still is, though he is long gone. He died at the outbreak of the Second World War. If you glance down his CV, you will see that Sir Charles William Ramsay was no fool, and he was a very able man. But what is very significant about him is this, that he studied under Ferdinand Bauer, one of the founders of the Tübingen University in Germany. And Ramsay accepted Bauer's view that the New Testament could not be relied on as a historical document. In his own writings, Ramsay says that he admitted he worshipped Wellhausen. If any of you have heard of Wellhausen, you'll know who he was. He was a German scholar who equally, in the late 19th, early 20th century, dismissed the historical accuracy of the Old Testament. So that's where he began. His training was, if you're going to dig up Asia Minor, that's the land of the Apostle Paul, Turkey today, if you're going to go hunting around in Greece as well, then you will find that Luke was totally unreliable. Half a century later, after his lifetime of publishing and working and traveling and digging around, he wrote this. He said, Luke wrote with such judgment, skill, and perception of truth as to be a model of historical statement. He says, I set out to look for truth on the borderland where Greece and Asia meet and found it there in Acts. He went on to say that Christianity, he said, you may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it. Now that's very significant because his total conclusion was that Luke has never been shown to be inaccurate. And I need to add as a rider that Sir William Ramsay was never a card-carrying evangelical. He didn't believe the Bible that was inerrant, and he wasn't adverse to suggesting that here and there Luke may have picked up a fable and just expanded it. But historically, and this is all that we're interested in Ramsay for, historically, he said Luke is utterly and totally reliable. You'll see that as we go along. Luke was very keen to give us a lot of information historically. You can do these figures yourself if you take the time. In his Gospel and Acts, Luke refers to 114 identifiable places, 25 political, military, social, and religious events, all of which are known to history. He wrote about the famine in Judea, Acts 11, and the expulsion of the Jews from Rome, Acts 18, both of which are found in first century texts. And in his Gospel and Acts, he refers to some 117 living people by name. Many of those, and some will come across shortly, are well known to history. So there's no doubt that Luke was very happy for his readers to check him out. And I maintain that Luke, in all his travels with the Apostle Paul, he must have kept a notebook. Now you say to me, a notebook in the first century? Yes, a notebook in the first century. Here is a first century notebook. Now here's a good idea. Instead of these long kitchen rolls of scrolls to write on, why don't we take a few slithers of wood or of parchment and punch a hole in the bottom, slip them together and put a ring through them. And we've made let's call it a ring binder. Now, this was a piece of technology that was quite new in the first century, so new that the Greeks didn't have a word for it. So they simply used the Latin word membrane, from which, of course, we get membrane. Did you know Paul was using a notebook? When he writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:13 and says, Timothy, will you make sure you send me some of my personal items that you've got? Oh, and don't forget, he says, the scrolls and the parchments. That word parchments in the original is the word membrane. Don't forget to give me the scrolls and, as important as anything, the notebooks. We need to remember that Luke would have been writing notes because people at that time were all writing, busy writing. Many of them could read as well. Every Jewish boy could read. You're looking here at the lovely wall painting of the local bakers at Pompeii, you know, the great city that was covered by volcanic ash from Vesuvius in AD 79. And the baker, Terentius, wants you to notice that he is no ordinary baker, and his wife is no ordinary baker's wife. We are educated people, you know. She is holding a stylus and a writing pad, and he has a scroll in his hand. People were reading agricultural and medical journals. They were reading poetry. They were reading history. People were far more educated than we like to believe. Luke would have had a notebook and writing things down as he went. Now, before I promise you, we will come to Luke in a moment, but I want to introduce you to somebody else, Simon Greenleaf, one of the founders of the Harvard Law School. He wrote a massive treatise of the law of evidence, which is still used in legal terms today. And any of you watching this who are lawyers will know that name. It was a massive work that he did, and it's been called one of the greatest writings of the law of evidence. And what Greenleaf then did was to apply the laws of evidence to the Gospels. And here are 5 points that he made. I want you to notice these carefully, because you'll see that when people are criticizing the Gospels and trying to say that they were all made up and we can't rely on them, you need to take these into account. First of all, he said documents have a right to be taken as a true record unless proven otherwise. Secondly, the author has a right to be considered trustworthy unless proven otherwise. Thirdly, the number of independent witnesses confirms the greater accuracy of the report. Fourth, the agreement of their evidence enhances the truth of the record. And fifth, their reliability is confirmed by known events. Now, those 5 points would be held up in any court of law today, and you'll notice where the burden of proof lies. If you have a document that I wrote, the burden of proof for you is to show that I didn't write it. I simply have to say that is mine, and you have to prove that it isn't. Now put the Gospels into that. They have never been proven inaccurate. Wishful thinking is not the same as proof. They have never been proven inaccurate. The writers were men of known integrity. They were, many of them, the founders of the early Christian church, men who had high moral standards, and they've never been known to be men who are liars. They are trustworthy. And God in his kindness has left us not with just one gospel, wherein critics would say, well, that's just the views of one man. We need more evidence than that. So God in his kindness has given us four independent gospels. And it's quite clear they're independent because critics spend so much of their time struggling to find out how they might be disagreeing with each other. And the agreement of their evidence enhances the truth of the record. They never contradict each other. Of course, they come at the same account from a different angle, give us different details, because they're coming, as I say, as independent records, but they never contradict each other. And their reliability is confirmed by known events. The historical details, many of the historical details in the Gospels are confirmed by known history, and that we will be seeing as we go. So let's start with Luke's Gospel. I will spend more time on Acts, but we'll begin with the Gospel of Luke. And this is how Luke begins. You'll notice that he introduces his Gospel, saying that he made sure he checked out with eyewitnesses, and he carefully investigated so that we might know the certainty of what he's writing. Now, we're entitled to accept that this man is telling the truth. This is genuinely what he wanted to do. If anybody wants to deny that, they have to bring forward the proof that all that is nonsense. You can't just dismiss it and say, well, that's nonsense. You have to say this is a historical document, the Gospel of Luke, and it needs to be treated as such. When he comes to the Acts of the Apostles, Luke is doing very much the same. He says to Theophilus, I wrote all about Jesus began to do and to teach, and the many convincing proofs that he was alive. In other words, Luke makes it quite clear that he sets out to write true history. And our bottom line statement is that Luke has never been shown to be inaccurate, and much of his history matches with known texts and inscriptions of the first century. So how does Luke begin in his gospel? Well, tucked into that single verse or two are a number of issues that have been raised. A census. The question is, did the Romans really have a census? Did they go round the empire, making sure that they had a census to know who their people were in the empire? And the answer to that question, William Ramsay discovered, was certainly yes, they did. There are accounts of many censuses. We'll see one in just a moment. And so they, like any government, want to know who they've got so they know how they can tax people. What about the sense of the entire Roman world? Well, the word world can be used either in a cosmic sense or it can be used in a much more local sense. The Roman world could easily be simply the Roman province of Syria, or as it became later, the Roman province of Judea. It doesn't have to be wider than that. But here was the problem, Quirinius. While Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, this is a big issue, and most people aim at it because they think they've found a mistake. And for many years, people assumed Luke had made a mistake because, you see, there were two censuses, one about 4 BC, which was the one during which Jesus was born, and one in AD 6. And we know that Quirinius, historically, there's evidence for that, was involved in the one in AD 6. So Luke obviously made a mistake thinking that he was also involved in the earlier one. Well, what Ramsay discovered was that, yes, it is true that Sentius Saturninus was the administrative governor of Syria around 6 BC and on into 4 BC at the time of the birth of Jesus. But where does that leave Quirinius? Well, Ramsay discovered that actually Quirinius was the military governor of the area in what was known as a triumvirate, a dual control. Sentius Saturninus was the administrative governor, and Quirinius was the military governor, but he was actually away fighting some battles against some tribal nations. But nevertheless, he was the senior of the two. And therefore, quite properly, Luke tells us that it was in his time. There's no problem there at all. That has been comfortably resolved. What about everyone going to his own town to register? Isn't that quite... No, surely. Not everyone would be expected to go back. Imagine that we've just had a census here, haven't we? Imagine if you all had to go back to the town or city you were born in, the village, the hamlet, wherever, in order to register. Can you imagine the upheaval? Well, imagine it you can if you wish. But look at this. This is a census document, an order from Gaius Maximus, the Roman governor of Egypt in AD 104, that's in the time of the Emperor Trajan, ordering all men to return to their home for a census. You see, yet again, Luke has been proven to be a very accurate historian. There's no quibble about the possibility of people having to return to their home. Of course, do understand, people didn't travel quite like they do today. Most people didn't have to go very far to return to the place of their birth. Many of them were still living in it. Notice how, when John the Baptist began preaching, how detailed Luke is. He tells us all these people, exactly who they were and what they were doing. And you may say, why did he do this? Why did we need to know it all? Well, you have your answer. You see, all of these people are well known by texts and inscriptions outside the Bible. And it's Luke's way of saying, I want you to get it right from the start, that what I'm about to tell you is rooted in history. As an aside, one of the things I find so encouraging about the Bible is that, unlike so many religious books of the world religions, it is rooted in history. There's history from the very beginning to the very end, and you can check so much of it. And as we shall say again, if wherever you can check it, it is found reliable, where you can't check it, you are entitled to trust it. Now, Luke mentions Pontius Pilate, and to be fair, there was never any question of who Pontius Pilate was. He's mentioned in quite a number of texts, but we didn't have much actually hard archaeological evidence for him. But you have on the left-hand side of your screen there a little bronze coin minted in AD 31, round about the time just before Jesus was crucified. And this Tiberium, this is a part of a stone that was used for a building that Pilate dedicated Tiberius, the emperor. It was then recycled, ended up as part of a stairway, and that's where it was discovered in a theater. But again, these are two little bits of archaeological evidence for Pilate, but we didn't need those anyway. Let me come to the Acts of the Apostles, because it's packed with historical references. Now, do remember, Luke was a travel companion for most of Paul's travels. Some of you are familiar with the fact that in Acts 16 and verse 10, we have what we call the we passages that begin. He now talks in the first plural. He talks about not just Paul doing this or Silas going there or Barnabas, but he talks about we. And it seems that he was very largely with Paul for pretty well most of the remainder of the Acts of the Apostles. And he was a very accurate and careful historian. So these are many eyewitness accounts. Now, you remember that William Ramsay was brought up to believe that wherever he discovered Luke writing as a historian, they would find that he was wrong everywhere. You may be surprised at the passage that really opened his eyes to the possibility that Luke might be more accurate than he's given credit for. And it's right in front of you here, Acts 14 and verse 6, where we read that Paul and Barnabas fled from Iconium to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe. Now, it was assumed that Iconium was actually in Lycaonia. And therefore, to say that you went from Iconium to Lycaonia was a little bit like someone saying, I went from London to England. And you would say, well, he probably doesn't really know his geography very well. It implies, you see, that they crossed a frontier. Luke had made a historical error until Ramsay discovered that until AD 372, and that's long into the Christian era now, Iconium actually wasn't part of Lycaonia. It belonged to Phrygia, an entirely different district in Asia Minor with a completely different language. And you will notice if you read on in Acts 14 that Luke is very careful to add that the people spoke in the Lycaonian language. In other words, he's making it quite clear where they were and that they spoke a different language. Now, the moment Ramsay discovered that, and that's actually where he started, he wondered if Luke was as meticulously accurate everywhere else. And that's exactly what he found. Acts chapter 12 records the rather gruesome end of Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great. He was king of Judea, and he set himself up, as you may remember, to be a god, and everybody cried out, this is the voice of a god, not of man. And the Bible simply records, Luke records, that Herod didn't give praise to God. An angel of the Lord struck him, and he was eaten by worms and died. Josephus, the Jewish historian, a contemporary really of the apostles, writing in the around AD 70, just after the fall of Jerusalem, he gives exactly the same record. He adds a few extra details, that the sun was shining on Herod's robes and the people worshipped him as a god. And Herod saw an owl, and he saw this as an evil omen and knew he would die soon. And Josephus adds some rather more gruesome details of his final death. But both of the accounts clearly are referring to the same thing, and there's no dispute among them. Now, I don't know whether you're reading the New Testament, you ever get a bit muddled with who the Herods are. There are actually 7 of them in the writings of Luke, although, to be fair, 2 of them are not referred to by the name Herod. They're just given another name or an allusion to them. But there are 7 Herods in Luke. Now, I'm going to spare you the detail, but what I want you to notice is that Luke places the correct Herod in the correct place at the correct time, and where relevant, with the correct title and area of control described. He is a very meticulous historian. No one will dispute his dealing with the Herods, the 7 Herods in the New Testament. But a list like this is quite useful to keep beside you, actually, because you can wonder, which Herod am I dealing with here? But Luke will sort it out for you. We come to the Apostle Paul, who was there at the stoning of Stephen. And when Paul and Barnabas arrived at Paphos, Luke is very careful to tell us the name of the proconsul at Paphos, Sergius Paulus, who he says was an intelligent man. Well, of course he was, because he believed the gospel. And this was an inscription that was discovered in 1877 near Paphos on Cyprus. And although it doesn't have much on it, there's enough for archaeologists to be able to say this confirms that Sergius Paulus was proconsul in AD 47, exactly the year that Paul and Barnabas arrived on the Isle of Cyprus. When they came to Lystra, I won't go into the story because many of you will know the account of how a lame man was healed and the people assumed the gods had come down. Now there is a little story behind that, the reason why, and Paul would have known it. He would have known exactly what was going on. You see, a legend had it that the gods had come down to destroy the human race because they were so inhospitable. And they came down, Zeus, Jupiter and Mercury. Now, the equivalent of those for the Greeks was Zeus and Hermes, but we'll look at them under their Roman names, Jupiter and Mercury. They weren't quite identical, but for our purposes that will do. And the people immediately assumed, you see, that the gods had come down again. Now, when they came down, they knocked on every house in Lystra and got no hospitality at all until they came to the story of two very old and poor hermits, Philemon and Baucis, his wife. And they gave them wonderful hospitality. And one miraculous things happened while they were giving hospitality. Food was wonderfully produced and so on. And as a result of this, everyone else was destroyed, but Philemon and Baucis were spared, and they became two beautiful trees in a temple area. That's the legend. And the people were afraid that the gods had returned, and therefore they worshipped Paul and Barnabas as gods until Paul and Barnabas began preaching the gospel. So there is a history behind that, and Paul would have known it, and Luke would have known it. It's exactly the same, you know, in Athens, and some of you will know this. The unknown God wasn't simply that the Athenians said, well, just in case we miss one out, we better invent an unknown God. No, there's a story here too, the story of Epimenides and the plague in Athens. Some 500 or 600 years before Paul arrived in the city, and Plato and Socrates tell this account. The Athens was suffering from a terrible famine, and they'd prayed to all their gods, and none of them had answered. And in the end, in desperation, they said they ought to send for the prophet Epimenides. The trouble is, he lived in Crete, and the Cretans were despised. They were not very well thought of. They were the joke end of everybody's wit. But nevertheless, they were in a jam, so they sent for Epimenides. And to cut the story short, he prayed to a god, and the plague was stopped. And yet he refused to give them the name of the god. In fact, all he asked for was no reward except that there should be a peace treaty between Knossos in Crete and Athens of the Greeks. But he refused to give them the name of the god. So they set up little altars, agnosto theo, and this was added to the gods in Athens. Again, Paul would have known this story. It's Epimenides that he refers to when he's writing to Titus, who's in the pastorate at Crete. So if you read Titus and you come across the quotation from a poet, that's Epimenides. Paul was well aware of him, and he would have known the story behind the unknown God. It's good to know that as the background when you're looking at actually one of the Paul's sermon to the Athenians. In fact, Athens was so full of altars to gods, it was actually said it's easier to find a god in Athens than to find a man. Luke is very careful to give the leaders their correct title. Now, all over England, we have town councils. It's a bit boring because they're all exactly the same. They're all called the town council, the borough council, whatever, but they're all called the town council. But that wasn't so in the first century. And across Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, where Paul was working, they all had their own titles. In Philippi, they are called the strategoi. In Ephesus, they're called the Asiarchons. In Malta, the protost. And in Thessalonica, they're referred to as the politarchus. And the important thing is that wherever Paul is, Luke gives exactly the correct title. He doesn't miss a beat as far as that is concerned. Confirming the politarchs, this was discovered, it's a 2nd century slab of stone that was discovered at Thessalonica. It was part of a city gate. And the very first word in it is a rather long mouthful, politarchunton. And this is Luke's history unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness, as Ramsay says. This is exactly the title of the leaders working in the town council at Thessalonica. Even those details he's glad to get right. I love this kind of detail. I throw this in because it always amuses me. The instructions given to Ananias to find Saul at Damascus are pretty precise. Go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. And the instructions given to Cornelius, send to Joppa to bring back Simon, who is called Peter. He's staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea. And I find myself saying, oh, come on, Luke, couldn't you give me the house number to make it a little bit more correct? But you see, even the name of the street, even the details like that, he is concerned with. That's good history. The Roman historians, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, both agree that the Jews were thrown out of Rome by Claudius, the Roman Emperor Claudius, between AD 41 and 51. Quote, since the Jews constantly made disturbances on the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from Rome. Now, there are some Jesus deniers today who tried to tell us that that Christus isn't Christ, but no one has ever come up with an alternative. So it's pretty obvious that what was going on was the problem of the Christians and the Jews. The gospel was being preached and the Jews were upset by it. Now, Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia in Greece, and he was appointed by Claudius in AD 51, the exact year that Paul was in Corinth. And this inscription on this slab of stone, actually, we've highlighted for you the fact that he is the proconsul, Gallio is the proconsul in Achaia. And the same inscription tells that he was trying to settle quarrels among the citizens. Now, you'll remember that Paul was actually brought to trial before Gallio, but as soon as he discovered that it was a religious issue, he wanted nothing to do with it. Oh yes, if it concerned politics, if it concerned military, then he was the Roman representative as proconsul and he would deal with it. But if it's religious, you sort it out yourselves, he said. And obviously he was trying to settle quarrels among the citizens. I needn't delay too long with Diana of the Ephesians, but of course she was very important in Ephesus. Her temple was a beautiful thing with 100 white marble columns. Until the Goths destroyed it, it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. And of course, when the gospel came, it was presenting real problems because it changed the lives of many. And the silversmiths were making little, this is actually a little bronze figurine, 2nd century bronze figurine of Diana from Ephesus. But he was making a lot of money for this because people came from all over the Roman Empire to worship Diana here. Oh, she was the goddess of childbirth and little children and hunting, and she was very, very significant. And because they were being put out of business, they raised a riot. I mean, riots followed poor Paul wherever he went, and the cry, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," went up. Now, that cry, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," is found in non-biblical texts as well. So it was quite a common thing that people would shout. There are religions today that have similar phrases that they will shout. But this is all that remains today of Diana's beautiful marble temple. If you've been to Ephesus with worldwide tours, then this is what you may have seen. But where is Paul's gospel today? All over the world. On to Jerusalem. When Paul arrived in Jerusalem, unfortunately, he started another riot, but it wasn't his fault at all. He'd been seen in the city with Trophimus, who was a Greek and not a Jew. And it had been assumed, you see, this is fake news. It had been assumed that Trophimus had been taken by Paul into the temple area, and that was a no-no. There was a no-go area where only Jews were allowed, and the whole city was roused and the people came running from all directions. You can just see the mob rule. We have it in our own country today. The mob will gather together and mob gathers mobs. And it was all over a complete nothing. But here's the important point. There was a notice that made it quite clear you should not cross this barrier. Now, this notice was discovered in Jerusalem, and it is in fact carved in Greek so that the Gentile, the non-Jew, can read it. And it was actually painted in red. The pigmentation was actually seen, and it read like this: no foreigner may pass the barrier and enclosure surrounding the temple. Anyone who is caught doing so will be himself to blame for his resulting death. And that would have been there in Paul's day, and that's what caused the problem. Of course, Paul didn't take Trophimus into the forbidden area. He wasn't that stupid. Uh, and uh, and I'm sure this is the very thing he had in mind when writing to the Ephesians. He said, Jesus has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. Claudius Lysias says, Luke was the tribune in command of the cohort. Now, that little account of the Paul's safe journey to Caesarea for trial from Jerusalem to avoid the assassination is very significant, because it's packed with information that is absolutely correct and has been defined and verified. The reference to the Egyptian that is there is a reference to a rebellion by an Egyptian, Thaddeus, and Josephus writes of him as well. The assassination plot with 40 men, we know about the Sicarii. They were a subgroup of the group like Simon the Zealot, the Zealots, who were known as the dagger men. The Sicarii referred to a small curved dagger. And the escort to Caesarea is interesting because he used some of the three main units of the Roman military. The heavy infantry, he sent 200 of them. The cavalry, 70. The lightly armed spearmen, 200. And they traveled all the way to Antipas, which was halfway to Caesarea. It's about 73 miles to Caesarea. They traveled halfway overnight, and then the foot soldiers were dispensed with. So clearly the tribune knew exactly where the Sicarii were going to be hiding out, and beyond Antipas they were going to be okay. So he just sent him off with the cavalry from there on. If you ever think that the distance was too much to travel in one night, you've misunderstood Roman legionaries. They could travel phenomenal distances with a 70-pound pack on their back, which is heavier than the luggage you put into the hold of an aircraft. And they could travel 30, 40 miles quite comfortably overnight, and a full day's march would be no problem to them. They were tough guys. So he was sent to Rome under Julius. Notice how Luke gives us the names of so many of these people: the tribune, the centurion of the imperial cohort, a cohort of officer couriers for communications between the emperor and the army. You have a centurion on the right-hand side there. You can always tell the centurion because of his transverse plume. It goes side to side rather than front to back, and he wears his gladius, his short sword, on his left side, whereas the other soldiers would wear theirs on the right side. This is the kind of merchant ship Paul would have traveled to Rome on. And I give you that because there is a book that I doubt whether any of you have read, The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. It was written by a man called James Smith, and in spite of his very ordinary name, you can see from the screen that he was a very able man, and there wasn't much about seafaring that he didn't know. And he wrote a 370-page analysis. It's not all the analysis of Paul's voyage and shipwreck, because a lot of it simply describes the shipping of the first century. But a large part, he analyzed every part of the account of the journeys and the final shipwreck He analyzed it in huge detail. Now, I need to tell you that this account is considered the finest piece of eyewitness account of a shipwreck ever recorded and accurate in every detail. Now, that's not me saying that. Scholars from all over have said this. The trouble is, very few critical scholars will have bothered to have read The Voyage and Shipwreck of Paul. I'm going to give you just a taster of his conclusion. This is what he says. No sailor would have written in a style so little like that of a sailor. However, no man not a sailor could have written the narrative of the sea voyage so consistent in all its parts, unless from actual observation. This peculiarity of style is to me in itself a demonstration that the narrative of the voyage is an account of real events written by an eyewitness. A similar remark may be made on the geographical details. They must have been taken from an actual observation, for the geographical knowledge of the age was not such as to enable a writer to be so minutely accurate in any other way. You see what he's saying? And by the way, this book is available online if you want. You can download it. That's how I got hold of it. Actually, I did read a hard copy, but then I realized you can get it, download it. So do download it if you want some very detailed reading. But you'll notice what he's saying. You see, there weren't maps and charts like we know them today. But Luke, when Smith compared Luke's detail with the modern day charts, he saw he had got it exactly right, because he was simply telling you what he saw. This is a very, very important section. That account of the journey to Rome and the shipwreck is much more than simply an interesting story. It is packed full of detail. Luke's account and Smith's detailed analysis are of the greatest significance. If this is the character of Luke as a historian, then his gospel and the rest of the Acts must be held in equal respect. Remember Sir William Ramsay? Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate as well as believe it. Now, for 2 whole years, Paul was under house arrest in Rome, and it will have struck you, I am sure, of rather odd the way the Acts of the Apostle ends. Tertullian, one of the early Christian writers around 200 AD, wrote that Paul had a similar death to that of John the Baptist, who was beheaded. That we cannot be certain of, but it is almost certain. Why were the Christians then and on into the future prepared to die for their faith? There is so much, so many, right up to the modern day, are those who are prepared to die rather than deny Christ. And the answer, of course, is in their firm belief in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, his death and his resurrection. In his gospel, Luke spends 1 whole chapter reporting the resurrection of Jesus as a literal event in real history. And this, I remind you, from the man whose accounts have been proved accurate wherever they have been tested. For 2,000 years, Christians have been prepared to die for their certainty that Jesus is alive. If you go to the Garden Tomb in Israel today, as many of you have to, and some of you will be longing to as soon as Julian can open up for you to get there, you can go into this tomb. It is not the tomb Jesus was buried in. You mustn't be told that. It's actually older than that, but it's very similar to the kind of tomb, the rock-hewn tomb he was buried in. And I don't know whether it's still there, but when I was there, when you come out on the inside of the door, there is a little notice that says, "He is not here, for he is risen." The resurrection of Jesus Christ demonstrates who he is and what he came to do. Or, as the Apostle Paul put it when he was writing to the church at Corinth, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried and he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. Thank you very much for watching, listening.